Hello and welcome to the Gospel according to Sheila. I'd like to share with you some of my Christian journey, which has been quite a long one as I've been a Christian nearly 49 years now. And I'd like to include some of the significant challenges I faced, as well as my encounters with God. I was brought up going to church from a young age, so I've always believed in God and I always wanted to follow him. But I never heard the gospel and therefore didn't know really about what a true Christian was until I was a young adult. The first significant point that I'd like to share with you was about a book that I read. I was living at the time in Saudi Arabia with my parents, and I picked up off a bookstall a book called Tortured for Christ by Richard Wurmbrand, which talked about Christians in the communist world, the underground church, and the amazing persecution that they were having to endure for their faith. And I thought, my goodness, I could never do that. And it dawned on me that there must be an awful lot more to the Christian life than I had encountered. I was very interested in that subject, and I wanted to help Christians in the behind the Iron Curtain by collecting Bibles that people had, surplus Bibles, as well as clothing to send. And a friend lent me a library book called God's Smuggler. Well, I wasn't a prolific reader at that time, so it took me a long time to get round to reading it. And in fact, I had to give it back to her, but she got hold of a copy of the book, which I then bought from her. And when I read that book, and at this stage, I think I was 18, and it opened my eyes in a new way to see that God was alive and active and working with his people through prayer in our day. And I was just amazed by the miracles that were reported in that book, of how Bibles were smuggled to the church behind the Iron Curtain, and the eyes of the guards would just be closed to these things when they were searching the cars. And God just really touched my heart over what I read in that book. And so much so that when I finished the book and I put it down, the Holy Spirit came upon me in a very powerful way. I was just sitting in my bedroom at home and looking around and looking out of the window. Everything looked completely different. There was an amazing beauty and specialness about it all that I could only explain as an experience of God. And it was as if I was seeing through different eyes. And I'm sure that if anybody had been able to guide me at that time, I could have been born again, which is something I'd never heard about. But a little while went on before that happened. And later that year, actually, I was queuing up outside of the Albert Hall for the last night of the proms, and somebody brought around leaflets advertising the Festival of Light. This would be in 1971. And I looked at the leaflet and I thought, well, I don't think I fancy this moral bit in Trafalgar Square, but I'm really interested by the thought of a huge Christian gathering to worship God in Hyde Park. So I determined to travel up to London on the train by myself to attend that. And it was in the days of Arthur Blessitt and the Jesus People. And at this gathering, which was absolutely huge, filling the park, people were going around putting Jesus stickers onto people that were there. And I saw something very different happening at that time. There was a vibrancy, there was a joy. People were really engaging in worship in a way that I had never experienced in the churches I had been to. And as the meeting dispersed late in the evening, everybody made their way through the underground to their various stations to get home. And there was such joy, and there was singing going on, worship was continuing. I was very moved by this, and gradually the volume sort of dissipated a little bit as people went in their different directions. I got on my train to come home, and I could hear people in the next carriage that had clearly been to the same event, and everything within me wanted to get out and get into that carriage with them. But I was just afraid that if I did that, the train would pull off and I would miss the train and be left behind. Well, God had a plan, because when I got out, which was almost the last station on the line, I think, the remaining people in the next carriage got out at the same station, and one of them turned round and saw me, and he saw the sticker that was on my jumper, and he said to me, where do you go to church? And I said, well, sometimes I go to this one, sometimes I go to that one. He said, oh, you should come to ours. And we kind of just smiled, perhaps a slightly embarrassed smile, thinking, well, that probably won't happen. And anyway, the next day I went to one of the churches that I used to go to, and the vicar was talking about why they wear the robes they wear. And this just didn't do it for me. This was just such a contrast to what I'd experienced the night before, that I determined, I'm going to go along to that other church next week. And I started going, and I found people there who really worshipped in a different way. It seemed to be, their faith seemed to be really real to them. And there was a youth fellowship meeting after church on a Sunday evening, and I started going along to that. Well, within very few weeks, there was a visiting speaker, a missionary, and he was speaking about the book of Ruth. And it was one of those experiences where he was preaching that it felt like God was speaking just to me. And I think it was the bit about where Ruth says to her mother-in-law, where you go, I will go. And something really struck home to me, because I had been planning out in my mind all the ways that I was going to serve God, the kind of job I'd get, how I would live on as little as necessary and give the rest of what I had to those more disadvantaged than me, etc., etc. There was, I guess, a bit of an arrogance about that, really, I suppose, thinking that I could work out how to serve God. But what I heard him say to me was, now are you ready to do it my way? And when the speaker came along to the Young People's Fellowship afterwards, I went up to him and I said, I just felt like you were speaking just right to me, and I want to give my life to follow God wherever he wants to take me. And he asked the youth leader, the lady youth leader, to take me aside. She took me into a bedroom and she led me in a prayer. And I went home that night, and I was lying in bed, and I don't think I ever got to sleep, because it was like waves of electricity just pulsing through me all night long. I still hadn't heard about being born again, but what I did know was that God had moved from somewhere right out there to be on the inside of me. Now, I started going along to Bible studies with the youth group, and I soon discovered what had happened to me, and realised that I had indeed been born again and given a new life in Jesus. And I was really sort of passionate and excited about this. So much so that actually I think I ran ahead of God a little bit in my enthusiasm. I had said to him, yes, I want to go wherever you want me to go. And I had assumed that that was going to be abandoning my plans, which had been to go and study psychology at Portsmouth Polytechnic. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go to Bible college, and I cancelled my place at Portsmouth. I applied to a Bible college, much to the angst of my parents. I was actually living in lodgings with a family at that time because my parents were still living in the Middle East. My mother came rushing home, and I came under huge pressure, and I just lost all sense of peace. And because I lost my peace, I reverted to my original plan, and I took back the place. It was offered back to me at Portsmouth. And do you know, I felt I had absolutely blown it. And I felt, well, God won't want me now. I've really let him down, and I felt desperate. And anyway, I had some months left before my studies were to begin, and I went out to the Middle East to stay with my parents. And I still felt, gosh, I've totally blown it. And I felt so desperate one night. I just climbed out of bed, and I was kneeling on the hard floor beside my bed. And the peace of God came upon me. And I knew that he hadn't written me off. He hadn't abandoned me. And he still had plans for my life. And so anyway, I went to Portsmouth and studied psychology. And while I was doing my degree, I met Ian in the Christian Union, and he introduced me to baptism in the Spirit. And we became very friendly, and our friendship developed to a realization that God was putting us together as life partners. And I married him at the end of my degree course. I then went and did a postgraduate certificate to train as a teacher. So we were married about 3 years, and I started a family. Now, I was thrilled to be a mum, but our first child, our daughter, Fiona, had huge health needs. And so this drove us to really pray a lot for healing, and I became very interested in pursuing divine healing, but I experienced a lot of disappointment because the prayers just didn't seem to be answered. And we had a son, and I had a busy life, and we were in a fellowship, and we were we were learning a lot about freedom and about I didn't really pray, and I didn't read my Bible, but I knew about the grace of God and thought, well, that's okay. He doesn't put us under any laws. But then I sensed God saying to me, well, that is okay, but you know what? You're putting up with a second-hand experience of me, just what you're learning of me from others, and I really want to relate to you personally. And I said, yes, I want that too. And God really, I encountered him in a very personal way, and I started to feel him, sense him really speaking to me, and started to move again a little bit prophetically. And then after some time, the leader of the fellowship we were in there, he said some things to me that were really discouraging to me. And I got that sense of, oh, I'm a failure. I've blown it again. I've let God down. And I went into what I described as a spiritual depression. It was a wilderness experience which actually went on for well over a year. But a wise friend came to me with a prophetic word right early on in that time and said to me, God is going to reveal to you a root of insecurity, and he says you're not to go looking for it, but he will reveal it to you. And that's exactly what happened. I was desperate in this time. I had a lovely husband, I had 2 lovely children, but what I discovered was they weren't sufficient. They couldn't satisfy me if I couldn't sense the presence of God. And the fact that I couldn't sense God's presence in any way was deeply distressing to me. But somehow I knew his hand was still under me. And in time, I was attending a series of meetings in another town, and on the last night it was about inner healing, and I didn't realise I had needs, dumbly, but God spoke to me through Ian Andrews, who was ministering, and showed me the root of insecurity, which I had been hospitalized twice as a tiny baby. And in those days, you were on your own. My parents weren't with me. And I had experienced a real sense of abandonment. And anyway, God dealt with that, and I came into a much deeper experience of the fatherhood of God. And do you know, when you come through a wilderness experience like that, you kind of think, I don't ever want to go through anything like that again. But at the same time, I wouldn't have missed it for the world, because God revealed some things to me that, especially that he could not love me any more than he did. If I was being successful in my own eyes, he wouldn't love me anymore. And if I was totally failing in my own eyes, he wouldn't love me any less, because he loved me completely as I was. And that was a very important revelation in helping me on a road to a much more secure identity. And I was still pursuing healing at this time, but my faith was very weak because of unanswered prayers. And then, you see, what would happen was my mind told me God doesn't always heal. Therefore, logically, he doesn't want to heal everybody. Therefore, how do I know, if I want to pray for somebody, that it's actually God's will for them to be healed? And all that did was weaken my faith so much that it was really hard to pray for healing. But then I realised that God never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So it really could only be my experience that would have to change. And I responded to this sense of call on him to suspend my very logical mind, my logical thinking, and choose to trust the scriptural promises I'd read. And one of those key promises was in Deuteronomy chapter 7, where he talks about Moses is setting before the people the choice of blessing or curse. And if they would obey him, then all these blessings would follow them. And, you know, healing was one of those. And God just spoke to me. If that was my will for my Old Testament people, Sheila, do you really think I would want anything less for you? So I started my journey to really trust him for healing, to pray for people for healing, and to also pursue healing for myself. And actually in my life I've experienced quite a lot of healing and some particularly significant healing from a young age. I had a problem with my heart that actually my parents never realised because I never reported it, but I used to get these palpitations, times where I'd feel very sort of dizzy and weak, and my heart would be going at such a rapid rate, and beating irregularly and jumping around, and I never revealed that until well on into my teenage years. And actually twice I was hospitalised as an adult in my 30s as a result of my heart rate going so high. Actually you couldn't count it manually. It was probably up near 300 beats a minute, and it was going on and on for hours, and actually 3 times I had to be put under anaesthetic and defibrillated. You know, that's where they put electric shocks to the heart to bring it back into rhythm, and that happened on the second occasion. That happened twice in one day. And I remember the specialist saying, you know, we cannot go on frying your heart. And I was put on beta blockers, which I took for some years. Anyway, there came a point when I was healed of that condition. and I could start to do things that I'd never been able to do without getting tachycardia or palpitations. I could start to play sport to a degree, play squash without getting palpitations, which had never happened before. I could really work out. I could exercise. It was just wonderful. Anyway, in this time in the 1980s, so I'm going back now a little bit earlier, I very much wanted a third child, but found that I couldn't conceive. And because I'd embarked on this journey of healing, I made a very important choice, which was not to interpret my experience as God's will, but to believe his scriptural promises. And he had been highlighting scriptures in the Bible, like there shall be none barren amongst you. And I realized that actually it was my right to have a child. And what I said to God was, look, if there is any reason why you don't want me to have another child, because it's going to get in the way of your plans for us as a family, then although I will be very upset by that, I would rather have your will than have my own. But you need to expressly show me or tell me that you are making an exception to your scriptural promises. And that was a really, really important thing to do. Whereas previously I'd have probably said, oh, it's not happening, so it's probably not God's will. It was vital that I kept on holding faith. Then one night I'd been listening to some Christian teaching, and it wasn't even on this subject, but at the end of the tape I had been listening to, the Holy Spirit came on me, and I started to encounter Jesus in what was my first ever vision. And what was happening was a series of scenes were passing before my eyes, and also I was experiencing them emotionally. I saw Jesus sitting on a throne up a staircase, and I started to walk towards him. He beckoned me to walk towards him, and I walked a few steps up, and then I fell down with this heaviness, and there was a sort of I was in tears. It was like I was carrying this really heavy burden, and I said, what's this about, Jesus? I don't understand. I thought we dealt with all of this, thinking back to my wilderness experience. And then he showed me that down below me, further below me on the staircase, was my little girl, who was just kind of crying for me in distress because of her physical discomfort. And I realized this had been a burden that was really weighing me down. And as I was there in distress, I saw Jesus lean forward, and he had tears running down his eyes too. And I got an insight into how he really cares for us and how he weeps when we weep. And he got up and he came down to me, and I thought, oh, he's going to come and pick me up. But he didn't. He walked right past me, and he picked up Fiona, and he held her in his arms and walked back to me. And she was no longer crying for me. There was a look of joy. She was captivated by his love on her face. And I've seen that look many times since when she's lost in worship. And anyway, he took me back up the staircase to the throne, where I was reunited with Ian and our son Andrew. And then he turned and he picked this sort of bundle out of the throne and put it in my arms. And I knew it was the baby I'd been praying for. And I thought, well, that's a strange way to come. I haven't even been aware of pregnancy. And he said to me, this was something that you couldn't do for yourselves, and it's my special gift to you, straight from the throne of grace. And he repeated that, and he said, and this is a new day, a new beginning for your family, and there's no going back from this time. I'm taking you into new things. And you know, within 6 weeks I had conceived. I worked out that Our third child was going to be born about a week before Easter, but God put in my heart those words, new beginning, and I knew that actually he was going to be born on Easter Sunday. Well, I didn't know it was a he then, although I did a couple of days before when God gave me the name, and sure enough, Christopher was born on Easter Sunday in 1986. So I'm going to fast forward very quickly now to the mid-1990s, and God told me that he wanted me to start getting up earlier each morning to spend time with him. That was a bit of a challenge for me, but I knew why he told me that, because I was leading such a busy life that if I didn't do it first thing in the morning, I would never make regular time to spend in his presence. And I began to do that, and he opened up new pathways for me. In 1997 to 98, I went and back to university, did a master's degree and trained as an educational psychologist, after which we moved to the Poole area to be part of church life down here. So I'm going to jump on for the last few minutes just to tell you about in 2004, where I started to intentionally seek God's voice daily through journaling as a result of a Communion with God course that Phil Reed introduced into the church. And later that year, I just felt God was telling me to go on a trip to Toronto. On that trip, my desire to be involved in healing ministry was rekindled, and in one afternoon and evening, I saw 3 people healed following my involvement in prayer for them. But that wasn't even the best thing about that trip. The best thing was a second vision that I had. I call it my altar vision. And I saw Jesus holding me in his arms. It was like he was carrying me as if I was a dead body, although I knew I wasn't dead. And I saw him carry me to the Father. And I heard him say, "Look what I've got for you. One more laid down life." And he laid me on a stone altar. And as I lay on this altar, I saw flames consuming my body, but not burning it up. And I realised afterwards, well, that was the Holy Spirit. And then I noticed that my arm was hanging off the altar, and Jesus came and kissed my hand. And then he moved around and he was kissing me all over my head. And I realised he was imparting to me the mind of Christ, which I had always desired. And then I saw the Father bend down and kiss me over my heart. And I realised he was imparting to me the Father heart of God, which was something else I'd prayed for. And you know, from that time, I have always been able to access the intimacy of God's presence at will. And I've continued to walk in that, and life just gets better and better. The last thing I'll say, though, is that every encounter has been preceded by having to put myself out in some way in obedience to him. But whatever it has involved, the cost has been negligent compared to the blessing that has come as a result. Thank you for listening to my story.